Now that we've talked about the process of sensation, we're going to begin to talk about the process of perception. So now it should be clear that there's a difference between these two processes, even though they may have similar sounding meanings. They're actually two different things. So perception, we should actually think about as the process of selecting, organizing, and interpreting incoming sensations to make into useful mental representations of the world. Now, mental representations of the world refers to the fact that uh, what we perceive is, in fact, a psychological experience. It's not there's not a one-to-one correspondence between our perception of the world, that is, our psychological experience, and the way that the world actually is. And we're going to look at a few instances of why and how we know that this is not necessarily the case when we look at some optical illusions. But first, we need to think about the fact that, as I've mentioned before, we're constantly being bombarded by stimuli. In fact, far too many stimuli are stimulating us at any one given time. We can't possibly pay attention to them all at the same time. For instance, right now, there's the sound of the fan. There's the sound of some water running in the background right now. There's the sensation of my arms on the table. There's a certain temperature in the room. There's noises going on outside of my apartment right now, but I don't need to be attending to all those things. I need to selectively attend to the PowerPoint slides that I'm speaking about right now. And so that's the first process that we see in terms of how do we select important messages. Well, attention is one of the basic mechanisms. This allows us to filter out and attend only to important sensory messages so that I can ignore the sound of the fan, the sound of the cars outside, etc. We also have certain types of neurons in our brain that are specialized in that they only respond to certain types of sensory information. And this is what has been referred to as a characteristic of neurons called feature detectors. That is, a neuron will respond to one type of stimulus but not to another type. And finally, another method of selecting important messages to attend to is occurs at a whole brain level. It's called habituation, and it's actually a form of learning, believe it or not. This refers to the brain's reduced responsiveness to unchanging stimuli. So we've talked previously about desensitization, the idea that sensory receptors themselves can become less responsive to constant stimulation over time. But in the context of habituation, that's actually a type of learning where we learn at a, like I said, a more holistic brain level not to respond to certain types of stimuli. So as I mentioned before, there's not a one-to-one correspondence between the stimuli that are in our environment and the way that we actually perceive them. Okay, and nowhere can this be seen better than in the context of optical illusions. So here's a classic example of an optical illusion that psychologists have studied in order to better understand this process of perception. This one in particular is called the Mueller-Lyer illusion. So if you look at the length of these two vertical lines here, it appears to most people that the one on the right is longer than the one on the left. There have been various theories proposed to explain why this is the case, but some of the research, at least, seems to point to the fact that we may have learned something about our environment that leads us to believe that vertical lines that have outward-facing obliques, the sort of the tails on the end there, are further away, and therefore when we see them right next to each other, we presume that one is longer than the other one. And part of the reason that this theory has been supported is because when you go to societies where they don't tend to have the same rectangular and square-shaped type of buildings, they tend to be less susceptible to this type of illusion. So here's another example of an optical illusion. This is one that's called the Ponzo illusion. So for instance, in this case, we see that the top line appears to be longer than the bottom horizontal line, the black lines there. And another thing I want to point out is that illusions should not be confused with either hallucinations or delusions. Okay, we're going to talk about hallucinations and delusions in the context of abnormal psychology or psychopathology later on, but for now, suffice it to say that hallucinations are false sensory experiences that occur without an external stimulus. For example, hearing voices when nobody is actually speaking to you. Okay, so in the case of an illusion, we're seeing something that is not representative of what's actually there. Okay, there's a stimulus there, but we're perceiving it differently than how it really is. Okay, that's opposed to a hallucination. Okay, delusions, on the other hand, these refer to just false beliefs. Okay, and they refer to usually things that are highly unlikely, like having the belief that you have been implanted with a radio device to record your thoughts by aliens, for example. Okay. Another example of a optical illusion, the horizontal-vertical illusion. If we look at these two lines, it appears to most people that the one on the vertical line is longer than the horizontal line. Again, this appears to be due to our experience. We're used to, for instance, roads being very long but not particularly wide. So we tend to perceive the vertical lines as longer than horizontal. Again, another example here, these ones are called the Shepherd's tables. The dimensions of these two tabletops do not look like this. They are the same, but as I said, there's not always a one-to-one correspondence between the physical world, the way that things actually are, and the way that we perceive them. Okay, so we're talking about this in the context of perception, but this really applies to many areas of psychology. That is, similarly, our memory is not a perfect recording of the things that have taken place in our lives, our experiences. We remember things differently than they actually occurred. Okay, so this is no different than what we're talking about now with these illusions. We perceive things as differently than they are. Okay. Now, psychologists have come up with a number of principles to try to help explain how it is that we end up seeing a whole from the parts that make it up. Okay, and that's what Gestalt means. Gestalt refers to whole, and so Gestalt principles refer to the fact that rather than perceiving discrete parts as separate entities, based on these Gestalt principles, we organize and see things in patterns that enable us to see a whole stimulus. So the top one there, the figure-ground relationship, refers to objects are seen as distinct from their surroundings. This is sort of one of the things that allows us to focus on an object. That is, whatever we're focusing on tends to stand out from the background. Okay, the thing that stands out is the figure. Okay, proximity, another Gestalt principle, refers to the fact that objects that are physically close together are grouped together. So in this figure, we tend to see 3 groups rather than 6 individual hearts. Okay, those are heart shapes. Continuity refers to the fact that objects that continue a pattern are usually grouped together. Closure refers to the fact that we tend to see these things as circles, squares, and triangles rather than as, again, discrete units. And the bottom there, similarity, refers to the fact that we tend to group those dots together based on the fact that some of the dots share a similar color to one another, and so we perceive the number 5 rather than seeing just those dots making up a rectangle without grouping them in any particular way. Another area that perceptual perception psychology has discovered is that to some extent depth perception is a learned behavior, but at the same time, there are also some suggestions that there is some innateness to depth perception. That is, we appear to be born with at least some degree of ability to perceive things in 3 rather than 2-dimensional space. Okay, and again, the evidence for this comes from the fact that in this example here, we're looking at a visual cliff. An infant will hesitate to crawl over glass, demonstrating the fact that he or she can perceive that even though they could clearly crawl onto the glass there and be okay, they wouldn't do so because it appears to drop off. So given that this is present early in infancy, of course, we can also see some evidence in infants before the age of crawling, because certainly infants are not born able to crawl. But if you just place an infant that has not learned to crawl yet, is too young, on that surface, you see changes in their heart rate. So even though they can't tell you anything, or there's nothing obvious about their behavior, there are more subtle things, like I said, the change in heart rate. And the other thing that we can see from the studying of depth perception is that it involves both binocular as well as monocular cues. Binocular cues referring to the fact that sometimes we get information from both eyes that tells us about where something is located in space, and other times we just need one eye in order to tell where something is located in space. So some binocular depth cues include retinal disparity, which briefly refers to the fact that given that your eyes are located slightly separate from one another, they're not seeing the exact same image of the world. That is, your left eye sees the world slightly differently than your right eye does. It's like you standing next to somebody else and looking at the same thing. You're going to see two slightly, even though you're right next to each other, you're going to see two slightly different views of the object that you're both looking at. And based on the fact that your two eyes are connected to the same brain and that information gets integrated, with the exception, of course, of split brain patients, as we talked about earlier, our brain can use that information about the discrepancy or the disparity between the two images to make inferences about where something is located in space. That is, the greater the discrepancy between what the left and right eye sees, the further away we perceive it to be. Likewise, we also talked about how your muscles, tendons, and ligaments have sensory receptors in them. Well, the further an object is away, the less your two eyes have to converge together to focus on an object. So, for instance, if you can make yourself go cross-eyed, you can look with both of your eyes at the tip of your nose, most likely. In other words, if you take any object, your finger, for instance, and systematically place it in front of your nose and then move it away and move it back, what you'll see is that your eyes will converge as your finger comes close to your nose, and they will diverge as you move your finger away. So there's information that is sent via those receptors sensitive to muscles and ligaments that also tells our brain about where something is located in space. But as I said, we don't necessarily need two eyes in order to perceive depth. Any artist that does drawings could certainly tell you that. There are also, therefore, monocular depth cues. Okay? Examples of these include things like light and shadow. Brighter objects tend to be perceived as closer objects. There's also relative height. Objects that are positioned higher in our field are perceived as being further away. So, we can see that, just from this picture here, each one of these examples can be illustrated here. The linear perspective, parallel lines converge or angle toward one another as they recede into the distance. Best example of this is a road, where that has lines on the road. They appear to come together in the distance, but obviously if you're driving down the road, they never get any closer to one another. Interposition, objects that obscure or overlap other objects are perceived as closer. Obviously, if one person is standing in front of another, the person that is obscuring the view of the other individual is perceived as being closer. Relative size refers to the fact that close objects cast larger retinal images than distant objects. Texture gradient, nearby objects have a coarser and more distinct texture than distant ones. For instance, hold your finger up close to you, you can see the ridges in your fingers, the fingerprints. But hold it far enough away, and your fingers look relatively smooth. You can't see that texture. So what are we going to do about the fact that sometimes we see objects that vary in terms of their properties, yet they're not necessarily any different. For instance, just to take a simple example of size constancy, as an individual is far away, they're very small. But as in terms of the size of the image that's being projected on your retina, they're very small. As they move closer to you, the size of the image on your retina gets much larger. Okay. For instance, you could see the person's whole body when they're standing far enough away from you, but as they get closer and closer to you, you can't see their whole body. You need to scan up and down in order to see their whole body. So we don't perceive that individual as growing as they get closer to us, and that's what size constancy refers to, is the fact that we perceive the individual size to be the same, despite the fact that the retinal image that's being projected into our eye is actually changing. Okay. Similarly, there are other types of constancy as well. This is the general term for this is perceptual constancy, but we can see it when it comes to shape as well. So if we rotate this quarter here, we still perceive each view of this quarter as being circular, despite the fact that clearly only one of them is truly circular. And another classic example of this perceptual illusion dealing with constancies is called the Ames room illusion, which is shown in this diagram here. So in order to experience this illusion, you'd actually have to look through a small hole. Okay, we're not looking through a hole when we look at this, so we can see the figure. The top picture here shows what we would see if we were looking through just a hole in the wall at the individuals. But obviously you can see from the bottom that the shape of the room is actually very different from the shape that we would perceive if we were just looking through a hole and didn't have all the contextual cues available to us that are available on the bottom side there. Another area that psychologists have been concerned with is how do we perceive color? And there are there are actually two different theories of color vision that were at one point seen as being opposite and inconsistent with one another, but we actually now have a much better understanding of them, and it appears that they're actually both correct in some way. It's very similar to the nature-nurture debate, where at one point it was a question of which one is it, and then it became, okay, the nature side of things can explain this, but the nurture side of the debate can explain that. Similarly, there are these two theories. Trichromatic theory explains color vision as on the basis of the fact that there are three primary colors, red, green, and blue, and we can combine these three primary colors to create any combination of colors that we're capable of seeing. For example, mixing green and red to make yellow. Opponent process theory, on the other hand, was developed by or was proposed by a man named Herring, who stated that he thought that color perception is based on also three color systems, but that the color systems were worked in opposition to one another, hence the term or the name opponent process theory. And so the opposite colors were blue, yellow, red, green, and black, white. So why do we see a picture of a green, yellow, and black American flag here with a white circle in the middle? Well, because the opponent process theory can explain much better than the trichromatic theory why human beings see after images such as if you were to look at this flag long enough, if you look at it up close, and then shift your gaze away, you would see an after image. And the after image would not be the same color as this flag that we see here. It wouldn't be green, black, and yellow. It would be red, white, and blue. And that's because blue is an opposite color to yellow. So when we look at yellow here, the after image will be blue wherever it was yellow. When we look at green here, the after image of whatever is green will actually be red, and similarly for white. So as I said, even though it was believed for a time that these two theories were inconsistent because they, on the surface, seem very different from one another, once again, based on the nature of science, we see that oftentimes as science progresses and we get more, we obtain more knowledge about how the world works, particularly in this case about how the brain works, we actually find out that, well, these theories can explain different aspects of color vision, and that the trichromatic theory can explain the way that color vision works at the level of the retina. The reason that this theory is supported at that level is because we do appear to have three distinct types of cones that are differentially responsive to these different wavelengths of light. On the other hand, the opponent process theory is more supported at the level of the optic nerve and the thalamus. Okay, the thalamus, if you recall, is a structure located sort of in the middle of the brain that sort of determines where information will be directed. So when the sensory receptors in the eye are the cones and the rods are stimulated, they transmit that information through the optic nerve onto the thalamus. And so moving from the optic nerve to the thalamus, that's where we actually see greater support for the opponent process theory. Another factor in terms of explaining, how it is that we have the particular perceptions that we do, there appear to be at least three major factors that determine what we actually see. Again, going back to the idea that what we see is not necessarily what's actually there. Okay, perceptual adaptation, for instance, refers to the brain's ability to rewire itself and adapt to a different environment than what we're used to. Okay, this was demonstrated in a very classic study. Okay, in the late 1800s, a man named George Stratton had developed a special pair of eyeglasses that actually shifted the world upside down. Okay, believe it or not, the way that the world is projected onto our retina and onto our brain is actually upside down as well. But because we're used to seeing the world in that manner, we don't perceive it as being upside down. Yet if you wear these glasses that are called prism glasses, it literally makes it such that anything that is in your lower visual field will go to your the lower part of your retina, and anything that is in your upper visual field will go to the top part of your retina. Now, that is in contrast to the way that it works without the use of these prism glasses. Okay, so in other words, when you're wearing these prism glasses, everything looks upside down. What Stratton found was that it only took a couple of days before he began to adapt to it. That is, at first, it was really difficult to get around, okay, because up was down, down was up. It was very difficult for him to make any sense out of what was going on. But as I said, as he wore these longer and longer, his visual system began to adapt to it, and he actually began to perceive the world in a normal way. Okay, and once again, when he took these glasses off after he had adapted to them, it took him a little while to readapt to the normal world. So our perceptual system is capable of adapting over time. Okay, just very basically, without having to worry about wearing prism glasses, we can see this just in terms of dark and light adaptation. That it takes a few minutes for us to adjust to going from a light room to a dark room, and vice versa. Okay, the frame of reference refers to the fact that our perceptions of people, objects, and situations are also affected by their context. For instance, an elephant is perceived as much larger when it's next to a mouse than when it's next to a giraffe. That might be why somebody who is short, specifically a male, likes to stand next to other short people, to make himself look taller, for instance. Okay. All right. And in terms of perceptual set, this is sort of viewed here. Okay. When you look at the image on the right, you can either see one of two images. You could see a young woman who's looking off to the right, or you could see an old woman who is looking sort of downward, but you can see her face more directly. The young woman vision, the perception of the young woman, you couldn't see the woman's face. Okay. Now, what I could have done is I could have primed you. That is, I could have suggested to you something that would make you more likely to perceive the young woman or the old woman. For instance, if I had just been talking about old women before I showed this slide, you'd be much more likely to see the old woman face. If I'd been talking about young women, especially one with a feather, for instance, in her hat, or with wearing a scarf over her head, those are things that could influence the way that you perceive the world. So that's what perceptual set refers to in a way, is that you can be influenced to perceive things one way or another based on your expectations. And this gets at the idea that there are two somewhat distinct types of processing that go on in our brains. There's top-down processing, which top-down, think of starting at the brain and then going down more toward, lower, more basic levels. This refers to information processing that starts with higher level processes, such as knowledge and expectations, and then working down. So you sort of move from the whole to the parts. Bottom-up processing, on the other hand, is sort of the opposite in a way. It refers to the fact that information processing can also begin at the bottom with raw sensory data, and then move up for higher analysis. We engage in both of these types of processing, but the top-down processing is really why we can be so influenced by non-perceptual factors, for instance, expectations, that we see something that is not actually present, or that we see things differently than they actually are, on the other hand. Okay, and then finally, one last word, given that we're talking about perception here, it's important for psychologists to address the topic of extrasensory perception. Extrasensory perception referring to the ability to perceive things that are not perceived by the normal sensory receptors that we've been talking about. So ESP, or extrasensory perception, it can involve claims like being able to read other people's minds, which is called telepathy, being able to perceive objects or events that are inaccessible via normal senses, which is referred to as clairvoyance, and being able to do things like predict the future, which is precognition, or move or affect other objects without touching them, which is called psychokinesis. For instance, bending a spoon. The main problem with the research, and there is research on looking at the degree to which there is something called extrasensory perception, is that sometimes there will be findings reported, but they just are very, very difficult to replicate. And replication, as we talked about, is characteristic of the sciences in general, and it's especially important because findings that cannot be replicated have to be called into question. Okay, if you report a result and then other people are not able to find the same thing using the same methods that you were using, then we really have to question the reliability of that result and any underlying theories that have attempted to explain why you got the result that you did. So there is research on this, but it just tends to be very unreliable, and until it can be demonstrated with a higher degree of reliability, we have to consider extrasensory perception nothing more than a pseudoscience.